Hello there, Internet. This episode is going to be a little bit different. Instead of interviewing someone like I normally do, I wanted to do a deep dive into some 3D printing industry reports that have been published lately. These reports usually come out once a year, and I think they are super interesting. And I also thought that maybe, just maybe, sitting down and reading industry reports isn't exactly your idea of fun. However, it is my idea of fun. And so I sat down and analyzed 77 pages of 3D printing industry reports published from 3 different organizations, and I am here to give you just the important standout highlights. Before we dive in, there are a couple things that I want you to keep in mind before going forward. And the first one is that these companies publish these reports as a lead magnet. If you're not familiar with what a lead magnet is, they offer you some sort of free information, report, ebook, something, and in exchange, you give them your email address. This is sort of a bribe that we put up with, or acknowledge that it's okay to do, and then they send you marketing messages so that hopefully at some point you buy something from them. Regardless of how you feel about this practice, it is something that we do in the modern world, and I went ahead and put my email address into all of these different organizations so that I could have this free information, and I'm happy to be able to learn from it. Another thing is that these highlights were based solely on my opinion and my experience. So we might have some forward-looking statements, again, just based on my opinion and my experience. I would definitely recommend reading the full reports and doing your own research before doing any like big life or business decisions based on this information. So with that out of the way, I will be analyzing 3 different reports from 3 different organizations, one from Sculptio, one from Fictive, and one from 3D Hubs. One thing I'd picked up on pretty much immediately was how different these reports are, despite every one of them still being a quote-unquote state of the industry 3D printing for the year 2020/2021. So make sure you stick around all the way until the end so that you can hear the different perspectives from each of these reports and get my key takeaways at the end. Without any further delay, let's get started with Sculptio. So I'm going to run through these reports. Forgive me, I'm not going to be looking directly at the camera all the time. I'm going to be looking at my notes. I'm going to be looking at my second monitor, just in case I'm looking all over the place, you don't think I'm crazy. So Sculptio is interesting. According to their About Us page, they were started in 2009, I believe in France. They are mostly a European-based 3D printing service, but they do say that they have locations all around the world, and they had people respond to the survey they sent out all over the world. Actually, the report says they had over 1,900 respondents from 86 countries. Now, I think getting 1,900 people to respond to a survey is pretty impressive, but the next thing I noticed is that 52% of the respondents are in Europe. So if you're not doing business in Europe, this information might be interesting to you, but it might not be a perfect representation of your customers or the customers that you want to go after. Another thing that I took note of is that 25% of the respondents said that their main use for 3D printing is just personal interest. So 25% are people, I'm guessing, that have printers at home. They're interested in it. Maybe they print things for RC cars or drones or tabletop games. Nothing wrong with that. I have printers mostly that I use for business, but also that it's mostly just personal interest, and that's definitely where I started in 3D printing. But it is something important to keep in mind. So the people that are responding to this survey, 1/4 of them are not using it for business purposes. If that's kind of the main industry insight that you're going after, this might not be the best survey for you right off the bat. Another thing I thought was really interesting looking at the group of people that was surveyed is that 38% said 3D printing is their main activity. So in the broad world of 3D printing and what it's used for, oftentimes it's used for things like jigs, fixtures, tooling in industry. It's also used for prototyping. If you are a company that wants to make phones or wants to make microwaves, you might use 3D printing to get a form-fit component before you go out and invest in before you go out and invest in tooling for an injection mold. It can be cheaper and faster just to 3D print a prototype first. But 38% say that 3D printing is their main activity. This kind of suggests to me that most of the people here are 3D printing services and not companies that only use 3D printing as a part of a broader vision for what they're trying to accomplish. So it's interesting. I always think it's important to take a look at, one, who the company is, who's putting out this information, and two, who the people that they surveyed, who they are, right? What their background is, because it, again, just tells us more about maybe the motivations behind some of the answers that they were given. One standout area that they highlighted in this report is that a big portion of people are using 3D prints for end-use mechanical parts, and they are also using it for increasingly large batch sizes, right? So 3D printing can be used for prototypes. Sometimes that's like less than 10 parts. You can move up to small series production, which I would define as maybe 500 parts at most. And then you go into large series production, I don't know, maybe a few thousand, and then mass production would be, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of parts. So they did see, I think the percentage that they highlighted was 77% of people are using 3D printing for end use. I got that wrong. 73% of what they call 3D printing power users are using 3D printing for end-use mechanical parts. I looked this report top to bottom, and I couldn't find a super specific definition of what they called a power user, but they do define it as significant investment and experience using the technology. I guess you can use your imagination to determine what is significant investment and experience for you, but I would probably define it, and I guess they hint at it a couple times, that they have invested over $100,000 in 3D printing equipment and knowledge. They also asked people what their top requirements for material selection are when looking at 3D printing materials. And the top three wouldn't surprise me. Maybe they would surprise you. I'd love to know what you think. The top requirement was strength. Not super surprising for me, especially if most people want to use it, again, a high percentage of them, for end-use parts. The second highest priority was, again, no surprise for me, low cost. Who doesn't want something that is both very strong and low cost? Seems pretty simple, pretty predictable to me. But again, I'd love to know what you think. The top three were strength, low cost, and easy to use / easy to handle. Those all make a lot of sense for me. The fourth place one, and there was a pretty significant drop from 44% of respondents agreed to down to 23%, was sustainability. And sustainability is another one of those characteristics that we will see come up in the next two reports in various ways. So I thought it was interesting that it was in every single report. Another question posed was, what is the top challenge for you when you're using your 3D printers? And again, most of the people who responded to this survey said that 3D printing was most of what they offered or what they did. And they said that quality control was by far the number one, by a significant, a 9% margin above any other activity. Quality control was their biggest challenge. The runner-up there was post-processing, which suggests to me that a lot of the people responding to this survey might be using SLA or SLS or high-speed sintering machines like an HP machine, for example, where there is a fair amount of post-processing. On the other hand, if they're mostly using FDM printers, I would imagine that their customer base wants a lot of painting or finishing done to those prints. Again, that's just based off of my understanding of the technology, looking at the data. There are two more key highlights that I want to point out from the Sculptio report. The first one is another, I think, really insightful take on the types of people answering the survey, and the second one talks about where the people who responded see 3D printing's potential for the future, which I found probably the most interesting thing from the entire report. But before I get there, one question that was posed is, what's the annual revenue of your company. And this ranged from not-for-profit up to over $10 million slash euros. So quite a big spread. And then there were ranges from under $100,000, $100,000 to $500,000, $500,000 to $1 million, $1 million to $5 million, $5 million to $10 million, or over $10 million. So there are different buckets that everyone could answer for. And what shocked me when I looked at this chart was that there were two very distinct areas. Okay, so the first one was 1/4 of the people that responded said that they were under $100,000, so they were making money, and they weren't a not-for-profit, but they were only making under $100,000. And the other bucket was about another quarter of the respondents was over 10 million. So this says two things to me. One, it says that if you are making money but you're making under $100,000, chances are, I'm guessing that this 25% is also the same 25% that people are only using it for personal interest. Because if you're making under $100,000, chances are you are only employing yourself and maybe one or two other people. This could be kind of a dicey topic depending on exchange rates and people's lifestyles and all this other thing. But I think in the broad world of business in America and Europe, at least, $100,000 revenue, not profit after expenses, just isn't a whole lot of money to support a different household. So I think that's probably where that's coming from. And then on the other hand, we have businesses over $10 million, which I would imagine are much larger manufacturing enterprises that, maybe they are running large scale 3D printers that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. They have high-end aerospace or, other clients that, are willing to pay lots of money for high quality parts. And finally, where do you see the potential of 3D printing in the future? I thought this was so fascinating because it broke it down into a few different areas. The first one was it'll have a significant role in manufacturing business and individual life. The second, it'll have a significant role in manufacturing and business only. 3, it will have a defined role for certain industries. And then there were a couple other ones. It'll be interesting for certain industries, but no long-term impact. And it's a novelty, a fad, something that won't have any significant role in the future. Very few people who responded to this, I think not surprisingly, said that it's just a fad. It won't have any significant role in the future. But what I find even more interesting is that it was nearly a perfect 50-50 split of people that said it will have a significant role. So even though most people responding to this survey are working in 3D printing, there's still half of the people who responded that are a little on the fence about how significant it will be. So I found that interesting. I also found that when you expanded it to individual life, that's an area that I think has been kind of kicked around as to whether or not it's practical for quote unquote normal people to have 3D printers and have it impact their individual life. I think what we've seen so far since 3D printing really started to take off around 2012 because some patents expired, is 3D printing is trying to find its place. And initially we thought 3D printers were going to have a place in every single person's home. Now it's been more adopted in manufacturing. I'm still definitely skeptical on whether or not it makes sense for people at their homes to have 3D printers. But I do think it's proven itself in manufacturing. And I think that's reflected in not only this report, but in the next 2 reports that we're going to cover. Our next report to go through is Fictive. Fictive is a company based in San Francisco, again, just from what I can gather from their website. And it's so funny to me. I think all 3 of these companies have nearly the exact same business model. So they offer an easy online portal and quoting service, and then they have manufacturing partners all over the country or all over the world that those manufacturers actually fulfill the orders. So they can tend to offer 3D printing, CNC machining, injection molding, all these different manufacturing services, but they don't actually do them in-house. So they develop the software, and And then the idea is that these manufacturing services get more business because people come to places like 3D Hubs or Fictive or Sculptio to buy parts. And then they're essentially a middleman where they process the transaction, they quote the parts automatically, and then the manufacturers, they do what they do best, making stuff, and then the software company takes some percentage of the sale. It's crazy to me how many of these different services exist. It's interesting. It seems like it's working since there are so many of them. But anyway, that's what Fictive does. It's fun to me how they are based in the United States versus Sculptio and 3D Hubs are both headquartered in Europe, though I believe 3D Hubs now has an American headquarters in Chicago also. But I digress. We should dive into the report. Theirs is laid out a little bit differently. It looks like it was laid out in PowerPoint compared to a document creator. So it's not based on a 9.5 by 11 ratio sheet of paper. And this one really focuses on manufacturing and supply chain. That's one of the big differences that I saw is both this report and the 3D Hubs report focus on supply chain pretty much exclusively, whereas the Sculptio report definitely focused harder on 3D printing, people who are using 3D printers, the materials they're using, and this one's a little bit more broad. And I don't think it being broad is necessarily a bad thing. I think it actually solidifies 3D printing as a manufacturing method to be considered compared to kind of sitting side by side with CNC machining or injection molding or anything else. So looking at Fictive, they have over 250 manufacturing partners in 4 different countries, and they are a parts-on-demand service. A lot of these companies will call themselves parts on demand, manufacturing on demand, manufacturing as a service. There's a lot of different terminology around them, but essentially they all do the same thing. You upload a part, they give you a price, you pay for it, and they send you the part in a variety of different materials. They had 230 people that responded to this survey, but they didn't say where those people were located. However, at the end of their report, they also say that they worked with a market research firm. I'm going to pull up who it was so that I don't say it wrong. Dimensional Research. They partnered with Dimensional Research, a company that does market research. No surprise here. This seems like a very typical market research type project. And both these companies are based in the United States. So I think, based on those two factors, that these people are all in the United States. Regardless, 230 people, far less people who responded compared to the 1,900 that Sculptio managed to pull together. Not that it's good or bad, just something for us to keep in mind as we're looking at this information, because context is so important. They also said that the people here were all in medical devices, robotics, automotive, aerospace, and consumer electronics. A lot of these people were directors or managers working in either engineering, business leadership, or supply chain. So this is a much more business-targeted report. Again, not that it's a bad thing, but something that is interesting for context. I also noticed that a lot of what they were doing was less pontificating, and it was a lot more directly sharing percentages and charts that they found through the survey. I'll admit, because I think they did more sharing of just hard numbers, I found less of what they were saying super interesting. That sounds so bad. I found a lot of what they had to say interesting, for sure, but not a lot jumped out at me compared to the other two reports. I'm not totally sure why that is. One of the first things that I took note of is that 81% of executives said that remote work has positively affected their attitude around flexible manufacturing arrangements. And that makes me really happy. I'm sure I'm not the only one who has had a job or jobs in the past where it seems like executives don't want to change things. And the remote work situation caused by COVID, I think, forced change for a ton of different companies to learn to work differently. And again, that has had its positives and negatives for different businesses, but it's nice to see that the executives surveyed here became more positive about flexible manufacturing, meaning, in my mind, kind of pulling from this question, flexible manufacturing, meaning more people are able to do more roles. I think this report also mentions cross-training people so that they can be more flexible, and also having more connected manufacturing processes. And so if people are in the office or on the manufacturing floor and at home, having that flexibility of location, they'll still be kind of plugged into the manufacturing process. I think having digital visibility over your process is going to be a trend that we're going to see only continue to grow as time goes on, accelerated by the COVID situation. This one also had a number of questions that jumped out in the high 90s of agreement, which just seems very rare and is higher than some of the other reports. So 95% of people surveyed said that digital transformation is essential for the company's future success. 95% is pretty convincing. And when you say digital transformation, what I gathered from the survey is that they're talking about two things. One being digital manufacturing, things more less manual in nature. So there's a manual mill, there's a manual lathe, but things like 3D printers and CNC machines are referred to as digital because they're controlled by a computer instead of being controlled by a human. The other thing I gathered from what they mean by digital transformation is the way that people communicate with one another, more digitally focused compared to everyone sitting in the same office. Again, a reference to a more remote work environment. When looking at companies' suppliers, 53% reported concerns around quality performance with their existing suppliers. If about half the people that are surveyed are already worried about the quality of parts that they're getting from suppliers, that kind of sends a red flag for me. It makes me wonder why they aren't looking for other suppliers, looking to bring more things in-house, like they're already worried about it. And a whopping 81% said that supply chain issues last year caused cost overruns. So cost overruns could be anything from higher shipping costs, projects running late with like penalties, receiving payments from different people that they might be doing a project for, or customers that are ordering batches of parts from them. 81% is high. It doesn't surprise me because of the crazy year that 2020 was. But still, I think it is a good indicator that supply chains aren't working for people in stressful situations. Having most of the manufacturing in the world being done in China just isn't working for companies anymore. Another thing that jumped out to me that surprised me was a focus around digital security and intellectual property. So 55% worried that if they started using a more digital environment, it would pose a potential IT risk. And I believe the 3D Hubs report also mentions cybersecurity as a huge concern for companies that are moving from a lot of times paper technical drawings that get taken down to a manufacturing floor to machinists, up to more digital processes where a 3D model can be used to generate toolpaths for a CNC machine or slices for a 3D printer, and then the machine just kind of does the work, and those files can be distributed digitally, which is a great thing if you're trying to manufacture the exact same parts at different facilities all over the world. But having everything digital and so easily processed could, if those part files get in the wrong hands, could allow people a much easier track to create a bootleg version of the device that you're trying to create. It's not something that I worry about personally, but again, running PowerBelt, it's not the most difficult thing to reverse engineer if somebody wanted to. But I can see that being a lot different if somebody was in aerospace or medical devices and had some high-end, very finely engineered devices that they didn't want being copied. On that note around suppliers, one thing I thought was super interesting was that 62% of the companies that were surveyed said that they are actively pursuing a reshoring strategy to the United States. again, this doesn't surprise me. I think we saw with the world's manufacturing center in China have to shut down for a small period of time due to COVID. I say small. Small is always relative, but they had shut down for a while, and then people couldn't get the parts that they needed that they were relying on from their suppliers in China. And so it doesn't surprise me that people are looking to bring parts closer to home so that you don't have as many challenges with getting parts in your hands when you need them. I will say, though, that even when maybe this might come across pessimistic, but I will say that when you look at reshoring to the United States, even the United States is not exempt from supply chain challenges. For example, we had COVID here as well, which caused challenges. And also you had situations like the snow in Texas that they were not prepared for, that if you were ordering parts from shops in Texas, that was a major challenge for them that did cause delays for some people that source from that area. You also had, I don't remember exactly what it was, but the big ship that got stuck. If you're listening to this in May of 2021, you'll know what it was if you were tuned into the news at all. There was a big ship. It had a bunch of stuff on it. It got stuck in a canal, I think. Maybe I'll do my homework and add some text or a link in the description of this video that says what I'm rambling about right now and struggling to communicate. But chances are you know what I'm talking about. It was a big world news story. Anyway, 62% of companies are looking at a reshoring strategy to bring more of their manufacturing back to the United States. But they do have concerns that they were asked about in that process. And the two biggest concerns for them were that the current manufacturing workforce doesn't have the training to run the latest technology. And two, high cost. High cost makes sense. Manufacturing in the United States is high. United States citizens have a pretty high cost of living relative to the rest of the world. I think the training aspect of it is absolutely something that can be tackled. And I'm seeing trends in the educational space with more and more training going online, where that's something that actively could be addressed for people to be able to successfully bring manufacturing, or at least big parts of it, back to the United States to protect their supply chains. The sustainability aspect is the last thing that I will point out in this report, because I thought it was both interesting and kind of entertaining. A lot of people said that sustainability and an increased emphasis on sustainability was important to them, and that they were increasing their sustainability efforts. It's a feel-good thing that I think lots of companies want to focus on. But when they were asked about what challenges they were actively facing, 58% said that they had limited control over what their suppliers do. In my opinion, that kind of sounds like passing the buck. Like, oh, well, we'd like to be more sustainable, but, our suppliers have filthy sustainability practices. You could look for new suppliers. They're probably going to be more expensive, and chances are you don't want to do that. And I'm not entirely guilt-free in this area, I suppose. Powerbelt sources parts from China because it is the most cost-effective place to buy parts, and they work with our relatively small volumes. I have no idea what their sustainability practices are over there. So I'm not judging people. I just think it's funny or kind of amusing in maybe a dark way, where people are, well, we want to be more sustainable, but our suppliers that are very inexpensive don't have great sustainability. And 36%, about a third, said that, we have good intentions but no practical plan. And I just think that is wonderfully honest of a response. I think that a lot of us probably have good intentions around sustainability or recycling in your own home, but the follow through is hard, man. So I found that interesting. When I look at all of these reports, it kind of jumps out to me as everyone is saying sustainability is important, which is so nice. But then it's always like the third or fourth priority around like on-time delivery and cost-effective delivery of high-quality parts when it comes to manufacturing. Those things are all absolutely the first priority for people. And then it's like, yeah, it would be nice if we were more sustainable. So it's interesting. I'm not here to judge the information. I'm just here to share it with you. And, again, I find it kind of amusing that we have good intentions. It's just no practical plan. We can apply that in so many areas of life, I think. Anyway, let's move on to the 3D Hubs report. I think this report was the most interesting for me. Things that I liked about it was that it was all about supply chain. But what they did was they pulled real data from their order volumes throughout the year based on location, and they also pulled data around COVID cases in those locations so they could actively see where the supply chain was moving, where all of a sudden in February and March, people stopped ordering parts from China because the manufacturing centers were shut down, and they started ordering them from India and then from Europe kind of as cases shifted. So I thought it was super cool. They also pulled in data from McKinsey and Gardner and from the data center at the United Nations. So it isn't just a survey that they sent out. Like, they actively pursued and compared their data with data from other broader research organizations, which I think makes a lot of what they have to share interesting and a bit more rock solid than just sending out a survey. 3D Hubs is a 3D printing service. Like I mentioned earlier in this episode, what they do is they have a quoting engine where you can automatically upload your parts, they quote them for you, and then they connect you with their manufacturing partners. They have over 240 suppliers across 4 continents. And for this survey, they heard from 1,281 companies to get their perspective around supply chain. And I think they crafted a really informative report. It's also the longest report at 35 pages. They give you some nice stats at the beginning, and then they have a nice table of context, and I wanted to just kind of point out some of the things that I found very interesting. So this report is laid out really nicely. Again, they give you some nice stats at the beginning. They have a table of contents. They define supply chain resilience, because this report really is all around supply chain. There's so much in here. There's lots of statistics that aren't explicitly called out in like bright letters and everything. But I did find it so interesting. They start out by identifying China as the world's leader in manufacturing, which shouldn't really surprise anyone. But they have a nice graph sourced from the United Nations Statistics Division, where they cite that China is responsible for 28.4% of the global manufacturing output, and that is measured in terms of a value-added basis converted into US dollars. So it's nice that we're weeding out any currency discrepancies. The second one is the United States, but it's only at 16.6% compared to 28.4%, so there's quite a gap there. And then there's another pretty significant gap down to 7.2% with Japan. But really, China being the world's manufacturing leader should not surprise anyone. I feel like most things are made in China, and it's backed up by actual data. They go on to describe the risk present with the current status quo of supply chains, and they talk about all different types of disruptions, things like cyber attacks, floods, earthquakes, a U.S.-China trade war, and a pandemic. And they kind of chart those out in terms of their predictability and the mild to severe impact that they could have on a business and on that business's supply chain. But really, the areas that jumped out to me a bunch were really their COVID-specific section, which I don't think comes in until close to the end of the report. So before we get there, I think that's where I want to spend most of our time looking. I wanted to look at cybersecurity because it was an area brought up in previous reports and in this report as well. They also sourced some data, not just from the survey, but also from some different cybersecurity expert reports. Over a 10-year period, 9% of companies will experience a cyber attack. I think 9% is pretty low, especially when you drag it out over a 10-year period. So over a 10-year period, 1 in 10 companies will experience a cyber attack. And the average severity costs $13 million. Again, that's average. So I would assume that, some cyber attacks are thwarted, if you will, and don't cost the company that much money. But if there's a cyber attack on a very large organization that might have a lot to lose, that would average out to 13 million, which can be a scary big number, at least in my opinion. Yet 44% were worried about their data security. This compares to 42 to 55%, depending on which statistic you look at in the fictive survey. So, but again, 44 is in between 42 and 55, so it seems like, 45%, let's call it. Comparing between the two reports would be a very realistic number about people who are worried about their data security when they start putting more and more information about their products and about their manufacturing processes up into the internet. But there is a big difference, I think, between the worry that people feel, the 44% that are worried about their data security, compared to the actual 1 in 10, just under 1 in 10, that would experience a cyber attack over a 10-year period. I would hope that people's concerns in this area would encourage them to maybe beef up their cybersecurity efforts a little bit, and be aware that it's something that could happen, but that doesn't seem to happen very often. One area that came up in the COVID section of their report, which I think is so telling to, I guess, the nature of people and businesses, was that 96%, so almost all of them, said steps should be taken to avoid future supply chain disruptions, but 48%, about half, haven't taken any steps to build more supply chain resilience. So it's just so funny to me how everyone agrees, oh yeah, this is something we should do, but only about half are actually taking any steps to make it happen. In this COVID section, they compared where parts were being sourced from. And again, they have a global network of over 240 manufacturing suppliers. So they compared where orders were being placed to actual data, which is publicly available, about COVID cases throughout the year of 2020. And they saw orders shift from China to India and Europe. And what was interesting was when they looked at the supply and demand of the orders versus what was available across these different continents, what they discovered was that the supply and demand were able to level out. The supply and demand were able to, the supply was able to meet the demand when working across all these different continents to supply orders to the businesses. But when people were relying only on China to produce their parts, the supply and demand was out of sync because of the shutdowns in the various spots of the world. And then as cases shifted globally in different areas at different times throughout the year, they saw where the parts were sourced from being able to shift with that. So when cases in India would spike, orders in production were able to increase in the US and in Europe. And when cases in the US and Europe spiked, by that time, China was becoming back online and able to meet more demand. And so when, whether it's a pandemic or whether it's an earthquake or a flood, having geographic diversity became so apparent as an effective way to reduce your supply chain disruptions. Being able to source parts from all over the world and having that network of suppliers that you could trust for quality parts became a very apparent important aspect to designing supply chains, which I would imagine is going to continue to grow as time moves forward. They also identified 4 key areas that are the most effective ways to reduce supply chain disruptions. And in that order is geographic diversity, strengthening your relationships with suppliers, automating processes in your supply chain, and increasing transparency of your supply chain. And then they go in further detail in how you can practically strengthen all 4 of those areas. The one that I think is most interesting is automation, and they broke that down both into 2 areas, both automation of your manufacturing processes, how things are cut, assembled, etc. They had a unique kind of example from Volkswagen and how they've seen continued success in automation of their big portions of their assembly lines. But what they also did was they looked at file processing time and quoting and how their software automates that compared with doing it manually. And just looking at the chart, it looks like they're able to cut down like actual delivery of parts by a few weeks simply by automating the front end of quoting and processing the parts for the manufacturers, which I think is really powerful because when I think automation, I always think robots. But automation doesn't have to be robots. It doesn't have to be physical processes. There's automation of software processes that, in theory, can be implemented much more cost effectively. There's no robot hardware to be associated with it. So it's an area that I don't think about all the way, but that I don't think about super frequently. But I think it's an important area when people think about automation to think about how they might automate a lot of their paperwork processes, for example, when it comes down to things like quoting, billing, all of those processes. I think it's a really good point to maybe keep in the back of your head as you look at your life, your world, maybe your email, I don't know, and where automation might be able to help out and save time, money, and headache. So, final thoughts. First, I'm really happy that these companies took the time and effort to make these reports and distribute them for free. I think that they will legitimately help people learn more about 3D printing, and I think people learning more about 3D printing and manufacturing is awesome, so thank you. Second, I think that there is no doubt that companies who make physical products were hit really hard last year with supply chain challenges due to COVID. I also think that 3D Hubs made a really solid argument and then backed that argument with real data based on orders in their system all over the world that having a geographically distributed supply chain can be a really effective way to work around any weak links that you have. Finally, as someone that loves 3D printing, I think some of the information that Sculptio put out about what people are looking for in terms of materials and machine reliability and part quality is really interesting. If you are a small manufacturer, maybe you run a small print farm, or you just want to get started into making parts for other people for money, I think Sculptio has some really useful insights in what your customers might want from your service. If you are a large manufacturer, say you make tablets or appliances or cars, I think the 3D Hubs report around supply chain challenges could be really useful to you. The fictive report kind of sits in usefulness in between the Sculptio report and the 3D Hubs report for me. In general, I think that they covered a lot of the same topics and information as 3D Hubs, but I think 3D Hubs went a little bit more in depth in how they covered the information. One thing I do like about the fictive report, though, is that it is shorter, and it tends to be really easy to read. It's got lots of nice charts and visuals to it, so that might be a good thing to look at. I also think it's really important to have a second source of information for these things as we try to sort out what's really going on in the industry and in the world versus just, what is marketing materials. That is all I have for you today, so I would love to hear what you think about these industry reports. Are they useful? Are they not useful? What did you find most interesting, both on what I covered or if you went and downloaded the reports yourself. What did you find most useful? Make sure to leave a comment either on this video, or we have a contact form on our website where you can shoot me a message. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to 3D Print Authority wherever you might be watching or listening. It helps the channel grow, and that way you won't miss new episodes when they come out every single week. Until next time, happy printing.